Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. And I hope you enjoyed yesterday's episode as we talked with Pastor Tim DeVries about what changed his mind from pre-trib to post-trib, what got him away from dispensationalism. And I hope you all enjoyed that. As the recording of this episode that has not aired, so Pastor Randall has not had a chance to see that, but I'm going to be asking him basically all the same questions that I asked Pastor DeVries. And again, there's no right or wrong answers to this. This is basically just his story and how these things worked. Many people, they want to know what it takes to change somebody's mind on this, especially a pastor, because we typically can be pretty stubborn on some things. But Pastor Randall, like myself, is somebody who has changed his mind when it comes to eschatology. And so we're going to hear from him today. And if this is his first time on the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. I have had him on my other channel before. We've done different interviews. He's preached at our church a few different times. He hosts the Potluck 100 every year, which is coming up actually this week. So this video is airing on Wednesday, and then I'm going to be preaching at his church tomorrow on Thursday, and then we torture ourselves on Friday trying to see how far we can go on foot. I have no intention of making the 100 miles, but I'm going to see how far I can go. So, Pastor Randall, if you want to go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself, your ministry, your church, and if you want to do a last-minute plug for the Potluck 100, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I did see that it's going to be possibly raining for the first part of it, so we'll be prepared for that. But yeah, looking forward to the potluck. It's always fun. Never know what's going to happen. That's just kind of how it goes. None of us are ever properly trained for it, so like we're not setting any records or anything, but we get out there and enjoy it. But yeah, so I'm a pastor here at Iola Baptist Temple, and been pastor about 5 years. Before that, I was assistant pastor, and I went to, in 1997, I went to Baptist Bible College in Springfield. I didn't really, I was in and out of classes, raising a family and doing all that, but I was staying really actively involved in my church. And then later on, we moved to Oklahoma City, went to Heartland Baptist Bible College. And same thing, in and out of classes, raising a family, even running a business, but ultimately working inside the church. And I learned a lot. I love the people there. Didn't have any issues as far as and I'm not like a rebel or like trying to teach heresy or something like that. Like we were all on the same page. And when I came here to Iola, I started out as a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor for maybe 8 years, working with kids and everything. And so when I became the pastor, by that time I had already changed my views on some things. And so, so about a year after becoming pastor, we started to work up in Kansas City. And there was a little bit of an attraction there of just online people watching sermons and stuff like that who are like-minded on many things. And so we started that work up there, and it's just been growing with families and people that love soul winning, and they love preaching and love the church. And so there's a lot of people there very like-minded. And, I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the interview, but people here who have been for many, many years more of a pre-trib mindset they now know where I stand. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't necessarily say everybody has embraced it, but they know where I stand. They know what I teach, and it seems to be okay. So anyway.
Well, good. Yeah. So again, your church is in Iola, Kansas, and then there's the Kansas City mission. So that's where I'll be preaching on Thursday, and always enjoy going there, but enjoyed getting to know Pastor Randall over the years, and good friend, good family, good church. But we're going to hear what you have to say just about, that change on these things, because it's a difficult thing. And so what would you say was the first thing that caused you to consider the possibility that what you believed about end times was wrong? Because fundamental Baptists, we're always right. We ain't changing. I mean, I have the we ain't changing mentality. I like that. But
Right.
sometimes you need to, sometimes, we're not perfect. But what was it that caused you to start considering that possibility?
Yeah, so I remember very specifically um, in Bible college, of course, that was something that I always felt like was way out there, just understanding end times prophecy and all the prophets really is super intimidating. And I just didn't really approach it much. Um, but I wanted to learn it. And so I knew all the buzz phrases that people say. And, I never watched Left Behind. I think that was actually after me going to Bible college. But I did watch back in like the 80s, there was Thief in the Night.
Mm.
And you remember that? There's a
Oh,
couple
yeah.
of different movies like that. And so like that was what I grew up learning. But when I read the Bible, there were a lot of things that seemed to puzzle me, but I thought, well, I'm just too ignorant. I don't know. I just don't know these things yet. And people would always give me charts and say, you got to talk to this guy, or you got to listen to this preacher, and I was like, well, I guess I'm just not smart enough to take all their charts and and really take it in. Like, I know this is what they say is going to happen, but how do they know that? And so in Bible college, I took an eschatology class, and I was excited. I was like, I'm finally going to get to know why we believe what we believe. And I was so discouraged that in the class, and again, this isn't putting down Heartland. I'm sure everybody has different experiences. And as I'm about to tell you, I dropped out of the classes. So like, I can't really say what all they taught, but I was so discouraged because they handed me like an encyclopedia of basically like pre-trib terminology. And then like, there were all these charts and there were all these things that were basically telling the events that are going to happen. And then there would be like all these lists of scriptures, but there was no context to them. And there was no, I didn't understand, how did they come up with that scripture as proving this point? And ultimately I just dropped out of the class and said, I'll figure it out at another time. But I think that I would say like that was the very first, and this is still, like I said, in early stages of Bible college. That was probably the first time where I was like, why is everybody teaching this? And it doesn't sound like anybody really knows why they're teaching it. They just know a handful of scriptures, like, hey, this is where I'm supposed to go to prove this point. And a lot of it seemed contradictory to me. So,
yeah, that's interesting, because I know when I started questioning things on it, and I'm reading every pre-trib book I can get my hand on, I'm noticing everyone comes to the same conclusion of pre-trib, but no one got there the same way. I mean,
yeah.
Every pre-tribber has their own version and way of getting there. And so nobody had any consistent use of the scriptures. And, you had those that believed it was the rapture of Matthew 24. You had those that said it was absolutely not the rapture of Matthew 24. And so it was just like, what in the world?
Yeah.
It's like, which kind of pre-trib am I? That was one of the things I was trying to figure out, because I knew it had to be pre-trib. So it was like, what kind of pre-tribber am I? And, everybody's looking for that consistency, and they don't have it. And so what would you say were some of the scriptures that really got your attention? Maybe the ones that caused you to doubt the pre-trib or to start thinking towards the post-trib. What would you say were the key scriptures?
Yeah. So first I want to back up a little bit. Before I left Bible college, and I never actually graduated. I'm just real short of graduate. I could probably take some online classes and graduate, but that's kind of a long story about it. I'm satisfied with where I am right now. But there was a guy that was on our bus route. I was working a bus route while I was going to school, and he was careful not to tell people exactly. He wasn't trying to teach something different than what the school was teaching, but he kind of made it clear that he believed something different on eschatology. And I remember when he graduated, they let him graduate, but he couldn't walk the he couldn't walk with the graduating class, and he was a little discouraged that they were, eh, they weren't necessarily treating him super badly, but he felt like, hey, they think I'm a heretic, and so like I couldn't sign certain things on the papers or whatever. Now later I found out that he believed much like I do now, and it's a pretty cool story how he came to that view. But at the time, he didn't really get into specifics about what he believed. It just caused me, I think, to maybe look with an open mind, saying like, hey, what if I disagree with this, and what if I come to a different conclusion? And I was a little scared about that, because I'm like, if I start teaching something or believing something that is different than all my pastors and my teachers, then I don't want to be a heretic, and I don't want to be, the guy that can't graduate and all this kind of stuff. And so I was kind of trying to avoid it in some ways, and just kind of go with the flow. But there were certain things that jumped out at me whenever I was studying the Bible and anything in times. The first was that everybody always said that he could come at any moment, and everything has already been fulfilled. But then that wasn't consistent with what I was reading and what some people were preaching about. Oh, this is a sign of the end times, like this is going to happen. And it says wars and rumors of wars, and earthquakes in diverse places, and famine, pestilence. And and I just remember thinking like, well, if everybody's always thought like he can come at any moment, and the Antichrist is going to sit in the temple, like all these kinds of things are just going through my head. I hadn't really studied them all out, but I'm like, it sounds like there's something still yet to come. And I'm noticing verses that make it seem like, hey, the church is going to go through, I shouldn't say the church, the saints are going to go through a time of tribulation that seemed inevitable. And I remember the first time I was considering, and what it was is I was studying that doctrine of perseverance of the saints. And everybody kept going to, he that endureth unto the end will be saved. And I never did understand what that meant. Well, how do we endure to the end? Like, who's this talking about? And one time I was just kind of reading it in context in Matthew 24, and I'm like, wait a minute, they're enduring to the end of this tribulation, and then they're saved out of that tribulation. Like to me, it that made perfect sense. And I think that kind of opened my eyes, and I kept holding on to that verse as I was doing my other study. Like, are we going to go through tribulation? And then I started hearing, people break down Revelation and show that, well, we go through tribulation only unto the seventh seal. When the seventh seal is open, God's wrath's poured out. And I realized, as I'm trying to come up with some sort of timeline, that the Bible tells us that, this going through tribulation only lasts like 3.5 years. And all of a sudden, like this whole debate about like pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, it's like, hey, we're all talking about like 3.5 years of rough times, where the church has, again, I said the church, but God's people have always gone through tribulation, and they've always gone through rough times. Why wouldn't we expect that there's going to be another time like that? And that seems to match up with what the Bible said. But I think that one verse, endure to the end, the same shall be saved, kind of opened my eyes to what I now think that verse means.
That's good. Well, yeah, because I mean, the thing is, most of your, independent fundamental pre-trib Baptists are also eternal security people, as they should be. And so you would think, that verse by itself can cause some questions, and so you would think, because it seems like a lot of people use it to disprove eternal security. So you'd think most Baptists would look a little deeper into that and say, like, wait, no, this is referring to physical salvation from tribulation. So yeah, that's interesting, because I'm amazed at how many people are content and okay with the fact that there are so many scriptures that just, go against their theology in a lot of ways, and they're not interested in trying to reconcile them. It's like, I want to reconcile all scriptures. I don't want to be afraid of any passage of scripture. And I feel like when you're wrong on dispensationalism, eschatology, and all those things that I feel like these people do. They avoid a ton of scriptures, and if you have to avoid scripture, it's because you're just wrong somewhere. So just fix it. You know, it's okay to fix stuff. So, how long of a process was it from the time that you started kind of having doubts to just fully embracing a different position?
So, that conversation I had with my friend and that worked on the bus ministry with me was, I was still there in Oklahoma City for a few years after that. And I kind of just put that on the shelf and didn't ever, really think too deeply about it. When I came here to be the assistant pastor and youth pastor, I remember a few times talking to my wife about, how some things didn't make sense. And she kind of agreed, like, yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either. But, hey, ask my dad, ask my grandpa, and they'd give me charts and they'd give me different things. And I'm not putting them down. I just got the impression that they weren't really ready to give me an answer other than like, hey, this is what I've been taught. And I don't really have a problem with anybody saying, look, I don't understand these things yet, so I'm just going to go with what I've been taught. Hey, this is what I've been taught. I can totally appreciate that. But it wasn't giving me the answers that I wanted on the issue. So, I keep studying it. And like I said, I just try to mull over, like, who's this talking to? And, why are they saying that this is for Israel? Like, it looks to me like this is, New Testament believers and all those things. So some time went by, and actually, Pastor Anderson, I went to I had followed him online a little bit, and I went to a wedding in Arizona, and he and I were both into ultra running or to running in general, I guess, and talked about barefoot running a little bit. We had these different articles that we were writing. So we met each other to go for a walk, and I had heard that he had a different view on the tribulation. I think right around that time he had put out a documentary. But I told myself, and he ended up giving me a documentary after I met him, and I told myself, I said, all right, I'm already afraid of changing my view on eschatology. I'm definitely not going to watch this documentary and be persuaded by, somebody that might be deceiving me. Like, I really want to see it for myself, and then I'll go watch that documentary, see if we kind of match up. And so by this time, we're talking about, man, I mean, maybe 6 years have gone by since I first originally started saying, I don't think I believe exactly, what's going on here. And I remember after we got back from Arizona and I was going to start going chapter by chapter in Revelation and just really breaking this stuff down, I remember talking to my wife about it. And, my wife had that same fear, of like, oh no, if you come up with a different belief, like you're believing something different, then everybody's going to be upset, and they're going to call you a heretic and all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think probably like 7 years had gone by, because it's probably like a year before I became the pastor where I really started thinking, okay, I think I get where I stand to some degree. I certainly don't have all the answers, and it's stuff I'm still trying to figure out, but where I finally said, like, hey, the model that we've been presented in terms of tribulation saints being the Jews, and about, being raptured at any moment and not having to go through tribulation, like all those things, I kind of like renounced those probably a year before I became the pastor.
Okay. Yeah. So 7 years, that's a long process. It took me 3 years, which I thought was long. Pastor DeVries that I talked to yesterday, I believe he said it was like a year and a half for him. So, but talking to people about this subject, the reality is most pre-tribbers are pre-tribbers because they were told they are pre-tribbers. They've not really done the study themselves. They don't know why. Don't get me wrong, some have. But most of them, that's just what they've been told. And so they just go along with that. But when you start seeing the truth, it's almost like an itch you start scratching, and eventually, you claw your way through and you get to the truth. And so it's what people need to realize about people that maybe you're in a hurry for them to change their mind on these things. It is a long process, and some people just, aren't thinking about it. Maybe they don't want to think about it, but it's just never give up on people. 7 years is a long time, but you came around, so that's good. But so fortunately, you had already gotten rid of that, when you started pastoring. But have you had any problems in your congregation teaching post-trib?
Not at all. In fact, when I took over as a pastor, our church unfortunately had gotten to a really small size, and a lot of older folks that had been here many, many years. But I think a lot of them, again, the end times was just something that wasn't really talked about a whole lot. And so I think most people were just like the majority. They're just like, hey, we believe he can, all the things that they've heard their whole life, he can come at any moment. And it's maybe some of the things about Israel, but I don't think anybody really had any really deep seated feelings about that. Now, there was one guy, he was in his 90s, and he was our trustee. And, I had just become the pastor, and I was just kind of trying to unravel where exactly I stood. And I taught this whole, I don't remember, I think it was a Sunday school class, and I taught the whole thing. I made this little scroll, like a paper scroll, and I had the seals on it, and I went through and just talked about how this is the seal and this is that seal, and after the seventh seal's open, and then it unrolled, and object lesson, and I broke it down, told them exactly what I believe. I even told them a little bit about my testimony and how I came to believe that. And it was interesting because we were getting a magazine, I think Zion's Hope or something like that, that was sent to the church regularly, and I was surprised to find out that the author of that magazine had a post-trib, pre-wrath view. And so, like, I was sharing like that, all these like coincidences of people in my life who had, had this view, and how it seemed so much more correct than what I had learned in school and everything. And I wanted to make it very clear to them, like, hey, we're talking about 3.5 years. I'm not turning the Bible upside down on its head. Now, it kind of does in the terms of dispensationalism and the Jews and all that, which, we might talk about here in a minute. But as far as just the timing of the rapture, not that big of a deal. We're going to go through some persecution. Hey, people all over the world, through all generations, have gone through persecution. And we can expect that if we're still alive during that time, it's probably going to happen. And before the rapture comes, but then we're still raptured out before the wrath of God's poured out. And I really was trying to drive that home, that I'm not teaching something crazy. And, after I was done, that 90-year-old guy who was very pre-trib and really into, loving the Jews and all this kind of stuff. And, I walked past him, and he was kind of like, he's like, I think there are good people on both sides of the argument, and you made some really good points. And he was like, there's no reason to, to be upset about it or anything. And so he was just like totally like, well, fine, you're going to be the next pastor. If that's what you teach, then, I'm not going to stop you. And then there was this lady that came up afterwards. She wasn't a member, but she just came from time to time. And she was like, she came up afterwards and was like, hey, isn't that what's called mid-trib? Mm-hmm. And she's like, I read a book a while back. She's like, and I think I agree with the mid-trib. I have no idea what she read or what she was talking about, but it confirmed to me, like, hey, people aren't like going to try to vote and kick me out of here next week because I don't line up on this. Mm-hmm. So it really wasn't bad. And then, like I said, in Kansas City, it was pretty much built off of people who, got saved under a ministry that taught those things correctly, and so that's been easy there.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that, and just from, talking to different people on this, is, like I said before, it's just kind of the default position. And so the thing is, when something is just kind of a default position, but you've not been taught why you believe it that way, you're typically not going to fight for it. And so far, nobody's having problems in their churches when they preach this stuff. Now, and they do with preachers, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But at the same, so that's a good thing. Nobody's fighting this. But you know what? I think this is one of the reasons too. Even when it comes to areas where the Baptists are right, most people are baptism by immersion after salvation because that's the default position of Baptists. It's all they've ever known, but they've not been taught to defend it. Their eternal security, because that's what Baptists believe, but they've not been taught to defend it. And that's why I think it's important in every doctrine we teach our people, not just this is our position, but this is why. This is how we came to that conclusion. That way they will fight for it. That way they will stand strong on it. And I think that's why you see so many people too fine with their churches changing away from King James. They've not been taught why. And so we're kind of getting lucky on the pre-trib stuff. They haven't been taught the why on that either. It's just been like a default position. Now, while I believe we can defend eternal security, King James only, and all those other things, you can't defend pre-trib. And that's why I think a lot of preachers just avoid it for the most part. But it's a strong political thing. And so while you didn't have any problems in your church, have you had any problems with preacher friends by being post-trib?
Yeah, so because I was a youth pastor for so long, I had some friendships already with pastors, and there are a few people that I had talked to that kind of already knew before I became a pastor that I was second guessing some of those things. And at the time, since it wasn't public and out there, and hey, he's teaching something different, nobody seemed to have a problem with it. And right before my ordination, which, I was ordained kind of like a pretty common way that the independent fundamental Baptists do, where we had like a board of like-minded pastors that we invited up, and people that I knew, and great men that I thought highly of. Like, we had all those come, and that the church knew. And I had talked to one of these guys he already knew my position on these things, and to some degree. I mean, we hadn't talked real deeply about it, but he knew kind of where I was coming from. And I said, what am I going to do in my ordination? If they ask me about that, I'm not going to lie, obviously, but at the same time, I didn't feel like it was something that should scare them, into not ordaining me. So the interesting thing was, and this is what that friend of mine said, he said, like, well, they're going to ordain you. They're going to ask you questions and all this based on what your articles of faith say. And I said, well, I realize that. And the thing is, my articles of faith say nothing about pre-trib or anything like that. It just says that we're premillennial. And I agreed with everything the way it's written in our articles of faith. I agree with that. And so basically what we decided was, like, just answer those questions that they ask you to the best of your ability. And it was never asked, are you pre-trib? So I just kind of kept it pretty simple, but explained to them, that about the millennial kingdom, and, we're going to be raptured before that comes, and God's wrath is going to be poured out. I mean, there were certain things I was saying, realizing that all the guys I was talking to were pre-trib. And some guys later on found out that I had renounced pre-trib, and that I believed that before the ordination, and they got really upset because they thought that I was kind of lying or keeping it a secret, whatever. Which is, it was probably 2 weeks after being a pastor that I sat down and told everybody where I stood on that, in case, to give people a chance. Like, hey, I want to make sure you know this, and where I'm coming from. I didn't think it was something I had to dig into deep with all these pastors who were just recommending me to be the pastor of the church. the pastor before, who's my father-in-law, I had talked to him a little bit. He kind of knew where I was coming from, but I think he just kind of thought I'll figure it out eventually. Like, like I haven't come to agreement with the pre-trib, but I'll come to. So anyway, it was just kind of kept from some of the men on the ordination. And so once they found out, and of course I already mentioned, Pastor Anderson, and having listened to some of his stuff and being a friend of his. And so people were finding that out too. So all of a sudden they were linking all this stuff to me. And I said, hey, I will talk to anybody about what I believe on any of these topics. You don't have to connect me to anybody. Just ask me what I believe and we'll talk about it based on the Bible. But it didn't work. Everybody started calling each other saying, hey, don't ever take up a preaching invitation out there, and don't have him come. And I heard through the grapevine that these phone calls were being made. And so, yeah, in some ways I was kind of denounced, if you will. Everybody's still kind of friendly to me whenever they see me, but not very happy that I changed on that thing. And it's really silly, because every time I've talked to any of those people who've challenged me, like, you don't believe that? I've tried to explain to them what it is I believe and how it differs from what they believe. I've never had one of them give me a good explanation of why they're pre-trib. A couple of them have been like, okay, well, that's not that bad of a thing, but still, you said that you were, you're not in our group though, because you don't believe that. But some of them like even acknowledge, like, hey, that's not that bad of a position. And then others, I had a few pastors that are like, hey, you don't have to try to convince me. I'm not changing. Just like you said, They're like, I'm not changing. I'm too old to even change. I remember somebody saying that, which really bothered me, because they're like, I'm too old to change. I believe this for that long. Like, I'm not changing on that. And I'm like, I mean, I didn't say this to his face, but I remember thinking, like, man, that's a dangerous place to be in. Like, if you find out something in the Bible differs from what you've been teaching, I don't care how old you are, you should be willing to change that, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, it hasn't been a huge problem for our church, but I feel bad for our church members who have other friends in other like-minded churches who might be getting some kind of sense of like, oh, your pastor's, Pastor Randall, and he doesn't teach this or that. And, I just leave it in the Lord's hands.
Yeah. Well, it is one of the things that happens to everyone, and I mentioned this when I was talking with Pastor DeVries. There was a time when if somebody would have told me they were post-trib, I probably wouldn't have fellowshipped with them, because I did not understand the issue or even why that's a big problem. It was just successfully demonized. We're real good at like demonizing positions, certain words, but we're not always good at explaining why. And it's a very powerful thing when you grow up in church and you listen to preachers telling all these horror stories about this preacher that went bad and he compromised and his life is a wreck. You don't want that to be you. And, and so we often attribute, this person's life just being destroyed by really small things. But the reality is, when you actually study out the issue, you clearly can figure out why it's not something people should break fellowship over. And so the overreaction that you get from people, it shows their ignorance of the subject. And so, people can look at you and it's like, well, you should have let people know, where you were and all that. But again, because you had studied it out, you understood, this isn't really that big of a deal. Let's not make it a big deal. And so, there is no, and so that's how it was for me. Once I actually studied it out, I'm like, yeah, this isn't something that we should break fellowship over. The fight in Paul's day was over whether or not there would be a resurrection of the dead and a literal return of Christ. Well, pre-tribbers, mid-tribbers, post-tribbers, they're all on the same page with that. Right. So it's not that big of a deal. So then once I came to that conclusion, I realized, hey, I overreacted to this stuff. I didn't take into consideration other people have still not studied this out. Therefore, they will have the overreaction too. People who are a lot more influential and more powerful than I am too. And so I saw a lot of that, and it was shocking, yet it wasn't shocking. I knew I'd probably get some grief, but it was actually worse. It was a lot worse than I thought it would be. But, so now, you've been teaching us for a long time. Are you able at this point to still fellowship, and do you get along with pre-tribbers for the most part?
Yeah. I mean, I've had guys preach, for us, and both here and in Kansas City. As long as we're right on salvation and kind of like the main doctrinal things like this, that hasn't been an issue. I always sit down and try to explain to them a little bit where I'm coming from, just so they're not shocked if if they start preaching something that they think that I believe, and everybody looks at me or something like that.
Right.
But it hasn't been a problem to me at all. Like,
Good.
I've had them come. Like, I think they feel a little uncomfortable just because, like, some of the rumors of, like, I don't know if I should be preaching here, or if I'm going to lose friends or what. And I feel like that. I could be wrong, but I feel like they feel like that. But yeah, mainstream, like, there's not a lot of preachers that I could call to come here for conferences or something like that. But I've had some guys who are just friends that come out to preach, and yeah, I get along with, to me, that's not a huge issue at all.
Yeah, and the only reason I would ever even mention it to most preachers is because I don't want to put them in a situation where they feel like they're compromising, or just because I'm vocal about these things. I don't want them to, like, be shocked and surprised, if it's something that they would be uncomfortable with. I don't want to make them uncomfortable, but it's, but I don't have any problems with that. But one thing too, I almost forgot I wanted to cover too, though, on this subject, what did you come around on first? Was it the subject of the rapture or the Jews, or was it kind of a package deal?
I would definitely say the rapture, because I still had in my head everything I had been told about the 144,000 and about the tribulation saints and all these Jews, and what's going on in the Middle East right now, and I think I was just as puzzled and scratching my head as I was on the timing of the rapture, but I think I just kind of let that go for a little while and said I'll try to figure that out later. I would definitely say that the rapture thing came up first. Now, what I did find out, that in some ways I think that it is a package deal, in the sense that once you start going down that road and seeing what it's saying, and saying that that's not about the Jews, well, then you realize how the pre-trib doctrine was, like, created by people who were, kind of Zionists. At least that's what it looks like. And so they have to interpret all that. So it kind of, like, it does. I can see why guys who were saved in a church that believes like me, how they get frustrated when they listen to their pastor, and I, of course, would never tell someone to leave a church because of that, but I can get it. I understand why they get frustrated, because they're like, what is he talking about? Why is he, like, making it about the Jews? And why is he, like, hey, got to bless the Jews and all that? And they don't understand where that comes from. But I think it's just been, like, something that's been interwoven for so many years into that doctrine that, I kind of, like, it was kind of like the final straw, if you will, of just totally changing over, when I realized, hey, they're wrong about that, about the Jews, and so therefore that's where they came up with all these other views. And so my first understanding of these things, I think, was with the rapture and acceptance of that. And then I slowly started realizing, like, who I believe the 144,000 are, and it was just like, hey, this is total nonsense what's been taught out there for so many years. And I'm talking about really good guys and smart guys and spirit-filled guys that love the Lord, who've just gotten off on that and are wrong on teaching those things. I'm quite certain about that. And so, like, it is a package deal, but I think in many cases it is like talking to a brick wall. They're like, no, I'm not going to change on that. And so, like, okay, well, let's just get along on all the other things that we agree on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What's funny about that is post-tribbers who used to be pre-tribbers, we have zero issue fellowshipping with pre-tribbers. But I think it's because we come from that world, we understand their minds, and we understand how it is very possible to be a very good person who loves the Lord, loves the Scripture, while being, wrong on eschatology. But I do notice that people who've never been taught that stuff and been taught right, they're often pretty hostile, towards the pre-tribbers. Like, how can they feel that way? And I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but I've experienced this several times, and it's always funny. It's like sometimes when you talk to someone who is not from the pre-trib world and they have only been taught the truth about this, and you're trying to tell them, hey, don't be hostile towards the pre-tribbers, and then they're like, well, what did they say about this? And then when you start answering for them, and trying to explain it to them, you realize just how stupid the teaching is and how stupid some of the ways they interpret certain scriptures are. And it's just like, so it's like you're trying to tell them, hey, they're not heretics, they're not bad people. But then when they're like, but then how can they say this? And then you're explaining it and you're just like, and if it wasn't for the fact that we were there at one point, I can kind of see why they're as hostile as they are. And it's like, they need to not be that way. And so I'm hoping maybe too, these, some of these interviews, these people who have been taught right will watch and they'll have some patience. I want pre-tribbers to have some patience with the post-tribbers. I want the post-tribbers to have some patience with the pre-tribbers, because I do believe they're good people. And they're not people we need to break fellowship with. But what advice do you have for those who are frustrated, maybe because their pastor still hasn't come around on this subject?
Well, I mean, again, if I'm talking to the person who grew up with a pre-trib view and has changed their mind on that, I think it's important just to remember that, hey, that was us before. You know what I mean? So, it's frustrating, but maybe just patience. Like I said, 7 years. Like it wasn't really 7 years for me to turn around, because I just didn't study it. Like I didn't want to be confronted with that. But it took 7 years from like the first thoughts of like, I don't know about all this, like, to actually studying it and figuring it out. But it was kind of a slow process. And so, I think we just need to realize that some people, they just, they don't really want to dig down that far. They don't want to take the risk of making their pastor mad or losing friends and fellowship and all that. So I'd say definitely to that group, just be super patient and remember, like, you didn't always believe that. You didn't always know. In fact, I would also always advise that, hey, we're still learning and growing, and I don't think I'm going to ever go back to that view, but there could very well be some more views that I'm like, hey, I haven't considered that aspect of this all yet. I'm still trying to figure this out. But it's just like in my mind, I'm like, well, I know it's not that. You know what I mean? And, so somebody who maybe got saved, got into church, in a view that's more like ours or whatever, that I'd be more in agreement with. If they're in a situation where they're in a church that, the pastor's not there, I think I would say, like, hey, it's real easy to make a pastor feel like you're attacking him. And so, like, if first thing you want to do is go challenge him on that and make it sound like, hey, I can't be a part of your church if you're going to believe that. Most of the time, they're going to just say, okay, hit the road then, because they don't really want to have that anyway. And then you want them to have trust in you. You don't want them to feel like, hey, this person's trying to infiltrate and he doesn't agree with me. He's going to start teaching everybody something different than I do. And then it's like every message starts getting directed at you. You know what I mean? Because they know that you don't agree with them. So And I've seen guys in that situation, and they get so frustrated because they're like, the preacher's always saying this stuff, and I know he's wrong, but he's saying it because he thinks he's going to change my mind or whatever. But you don't want that preacher's whole ministry to be like trying to correct you or something. Does that make sense? Like, I think just kind of just maybe don't make a big deal about it.
Right. Yeah,
See
they
that
should.
pastor and just
Yeah, the pastor should
Go ahead.
never feel like you're giving them an ultimatum. Like, agree with me on this, and you've got this much time to do it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'm leaving the church.
Yeah.
And and we had somebody that came to our church years ago who they believed in the flat Earth, and and blessed our hearts. We still loved them and all that, and we talked about it and we disagreed, and and I could tell there was always a part of them that hoped I was going to come around, and I could always tell they were somewhat disappointed in me because I wasn't coming around on that. But it's just like, I'm sorry, I wasn't coming around, and we were always able to get along. But then I did get pretty upset one time when they felt like, when they told me that they felt like I was not switching to flat Earth because of the political pressure. And it's just like, okay, first off, I think I've proven I don't give in to political pressure.
Right.
Do you ever think maybe I just disagree with you? And and again, even with the eschatology, sometimes it's political pressure. It is. Sometimes they just disagree, and you got to be okay with that. And so, and it was, and and eventually, this person had all kinds of issues with me. And I will always be convinced that it was because I never agreed with them on their flat Earth doctrine. And, people, what they need to do is, especially when you go into a church that was already pre-trib, you should never give the pastor an ultimatum. You don't go in there with the goal of changing him. You can let him know your position and then, just pray. But either way, if you can't handle the fact that he's not post-trib, then you just probably shouldn't even be in that church. You can't just be sitting around there, keeping pressure on him, waiting for him to change. I think that's a terrible attitude, and it's not going to accomplish anything. But yeah, so I think that's good advice.
Yeah, and if I got somebody that started coming to our church that I knew was like that at another church, like, even if we're in agreement on that doctrine, I'm thinking in my head, like, how long before there's another issue that they treat me that way, So, like, we got to understand that nobody's going to have the exact 100% views and convictions that you have. And so, raise your own family,
Right.
and bring them to church. And, like, if you don't agree, like, teach your family where you differ, and don't make a big deal about it, and keep serving the Lord.
No, that's a good point, because anybody that would cause division in a church over something like that, they obviously don't have their priorities right. They have some major character flaws. They don't understand proper authority. They don't understand church authority. And so even though they're right on eschatology, they're going to carry over all of those personal flaws in their life to your church. And it will create a problem somewhere, for sure. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And so this next question, this is purely an opinion question. I'm not asking to make a prophecy or anything like that. But in your opinion, do you think that the eye of the independent fundamental Baptist world will continue to remain mostly pre-trib, or do you think this is something that's probably going to die out in the near future once certain key popes are out of the way?
Man, it's hard to even know what the future holds for independent Baptists. For a long time, I think I was under the impression that, hey, like you said, when some of these guys pass off the scene who've been teaching that, like, I don't think the next, especially when it comes to like hyper dispensation type, teaching, I don't think the next generation is going to embrace that. But now I'm seeing these young guys who are like trying to bring back those old things. And then, like you said, with the, just for an example, like the flat Earth that you brought up and all these kinds of things, people were just holding on to all kinds of stuff. And so, like, I don't know. I suppose the fact that we're independent and that nobody's writing what it is that we're supposed to believe. I would say like there's probably always going to be a whole plethora of different views out there, and I think pre-trib will probably hold on as,
Mhm.
but hopefully those who have renounced that will be accepted as well as independent Baptists, and not like, hey, you need to take the name Baptist off because you're not. Well, man, you don't know the history of Baptists then, because they
Mhm.
didn't all believe that,
Right.
historically. So
Yeah, that's true. So, who are some of your favorite pre-tribbers? Do you have any favorite pre-trib preachers that you like?
you know, I've never really been, as far as guys that are hardcore prophecy teachers.
No, and I don't mean that like I don't mean that like because
Oh, just people
you
who
like their
are,
pre-trib
yeah,
teaching, but just like
yeah,
preachers that you love and respect, that you learn from, but they happen to be
sure.
pre-tribbers. Who-
Yeah, well, again, the amount of time I spent at Heartland and going to Southwest Baptist Church, like Brother Sam Davison's always been a huge influence in my life. And even now, I would sit down and talk with him, and I wouldn't I wouldn't be a jerk about it or anything like that. But I don't that wouldn't make me think any less of him that I disagree with him on that subject. But he's a very wise man and filled with the Holy Ghost, and I always feel like when I listen to his preaching, or when I used to sit down and get counsel from him, that hey, he's heard from God. But that doesn't mean, because everybody can do that and still be wrong on some issues. So it doesn't mean because a man's righteous and he loves the Lord and he's filled with the Holy Spirit that he's not that he's never going to be off on certain doctrines. Like
Mm,
there's no way any of us are ever going to be lined up perfectly on everything. Like we're always learning and growing and conform. So anyway, but he's always, every time someone asks me who's your favorite preacher, like it's always Brother Sam Davison. He just had such an influence on my life.
yeah, I've never been close to him personally. He visited our church. He was passing through last year, and I was thrilled to see him. I've always had a ton of respect for him. And yeah, and he's somebody, if I had a chance to sit down and talk with him, I would just be listening.
Yeah,
I would love, because I can tell you right now, he's got a lot more he could teach me than I could teach him, you know. But ultimately my
yeah,
loyalty to the scripture doesn't mean I'm just going
right.
to go along with whatever he says, but I have no doubt there's an enormous amount that I could learn from somebody like him. And I even asked him to preach. He didn't want to. It was like right before
Yeah,
church. Yeah, but I would have let him in a heartbeat, and I'd have been thrilled. I was just glad to have him at the service. But yeah, no, I think he's definitely a good example of one. But well, hey, I definitely appreciate you doing this. Do you have any final
yeah.
remarks for the audience?
No, I mean, I think I want to mention that I think what you're doing here with this podcast is really cool. Like, I don't know how you find the time to do. It seems like you're uploading something every day. Uh, so I've still got a lot to listen to go back and catch up on on them. But
Mhm.
I think you're doing a good job. And I mean, I feel a little bit like unworthy to be interviewed, but this is right up my alley because I can give you my testimony. But man, there's some of those conversations get super deep.
Yeah, well, I said
But
I enjoyed. It's not easy. I keep saying I'm going to slow down putting out content, but I'm having a tough
yeah,
time stopping. I'm just
right.
I do enjoy doing it, and it's a lot of
But
fun.
yeah, I recommend people listen to it because I think they can learn a lot, and I think most importantly, you're teaching a spirit of hey, be willing to listen to other people, and Bible's our final authority. So
Right. And yeah,
yeah,
and let me just put out a reminder to everybody. While I talk a lot about this, I'm ultimately about advancing the conversation in certain areas. I recognize my limited knowledge in many areas on eschatology. I do not think I know it all when it comes to this subject. Here's what I do know is that uh, I do know that what the pre-tribbers are teaching is just dead wrong and flawed on many levels. And I do think even in our post-trib world, I think there's so much more that we have to explore. And I just want to get people talking about these things. I feel like dispensationalism, the pre-trib doctrine, these are brick walls that if you can bust through them, you're going to just find these just worlds of scripture and great teaching that there is left to explore. But if you're married to these errors, you're just not going to grow. And I want to keep growing. I want to keep learning. And so I'm willing to talk. I'm willing to be challenged, and I'm willing to change something if I need to. That's kind of why I'm doing this. I definitely do not see myself as any type of guru, but I am somebody who I have the unique ability to admit I'm wrong. And I also have the unique ability to handle being challenged without it, make me foam at the mouth. And so I welcome it, because if I got something wrong, I want to correct it. So,
right.
But hey,
amen.
Again, appreciate you. Looking forward to getting out there and enjoying the fellowship and the Potluck 100. And so if you live anywhere around Kansas City, Thursday, 7 o'clock, Iola Baptist. Yeah, what's that? October 13th.
October 13th.
Yep, at the Iola Baptist Kansas City Mission. We'll be there, and make sure you check out Pastor Randall's YouTube channel. I'll leave a link in the description. And so appreciate everyone joining us today, and we will see you all next time. God bless.